Hi, I'm Dana Cruikshank with the National Science Foundation. Scientists have long understood that multicellular organisms use certain chemicals to communicate between their cells. Scientists have recently discovered, however, that a single-cell organism also contains these same chemical communicators. Joining us today is Dr. David Pincus and Wendell Lim of the University of California at San Francisco. Well, I'm wondering if maybe you could give us an idea of what your research entailed.
Our lab is focused on trying to understand cell signaling, and that's the area of trying to understand how cells sense what's going on in their environment and make decisions. And basically, cells have a lot of different molecules within them that process this information, kind of like a small computer.
Could you perhaps tell me about this single-celled organism that you studied?
Yeah, so this work was on a single-celled organism called choanoflagellates. The reason we were interested in this is that typically, so if you think about cells in a multicellular organism, many of the things that they have to sense are signals that come from other cells in the same body, so that the body, our bodies, for example, can act as one coherent unit. But for single-celled organisms, it's quite different. They just have to sense what's going on in their environment. Now, for the most part, the molecules and chemicals that are used to mediate signaling between cells in a multicellular organism like ourselves are different from those used by single-celled organisms. But what was discovered is that in the choanoflagellate, they actually use some of the same chemicals that are used for communication in multicellular organisms. And this was really quite surprising. And they, in fact, use them. They have as many molecules of this type as we do.
Interesting. David, I wonder if you could share with us, what might these single-celled organisms use these chemicals for?
So like Wendell was saying, these single-celled organisms have just as many of these communicating molecules as multicellular organisms do, but clearly they don't have the same function to do with them. And while we're not exactly sure what they do with them yet, since we haven't done the actual biological experiments to determine that exhaustively, we do know that they must be using them for extremely divergent functions, which is a new insight into evolution, which we had never known before.
I think this, one of the important things is that it shows how evolution might work, that probably there was an ancestor to these organisms that first developed this new kind of chemical called phosphatyrosine, and that multicellular organisms used it then for communication between cells, but then that these other organisms, choanoflagellates, used them for some other purpose. And I think it shows that these pieces, these molecules that evolution uses, aren't specifically designed for one purpose, but they really are probably parts that evolution then borrows to do different things.
Interesting. Is it possible that multicellular organisms could also use these same chemicals for other purposes aside from cell-to-cell communication?
So we have no evidence for that yet, but absolutely. There's a certain amount of signaling you can do, and you can allocate that for apparently whatever function you want.
So what are some of the implications of this work? Where could you go from here?
We're trying to understand what these organisms use these molecules for, and actually to track throughout many different species how these are used. And I think it will really give a lot of insight into understanding the problem of how multicellular organisms first evolved, because that was a really major thing, a major innovation. This is also really linked to the problem of cancer, because these components, these phosphatyrosine signaling components, are also some of the major targets for cancer, because when there are problems arise with these components, you get problems with regulating cell growth and so forth, resulting in cancer. So I think we can get also a lot of insight into how those sorts of diseases come about.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your research with us.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's great to be here.
Again, we were joined today by David Pincus and Wendell Lim of the University of California, San Francisco. I'm Dana Cruikshank from the National Science Foundation. Thanks for joining us.